Against all odds, the dreamer with a vision. The relentless sound of gunshots echoed through the night, but Marcus wasn't startled. He sat by the flickering streetlight, notebook in hand, sketching out his business idea for the 50th time. To everyone around him, he was just another kid from the projects, destined to fail. But in his mind, he was already building an empire. Growing up in a neighborhood where violence was more common than opportunity, Marcus knew the odds were stacked against him. His family struggled to make ends meet, and most of his friends had already given up on their dreams, succumbing to the harsh reality of their environment. But Marcus was different. Ever since he was a child, he had an unshakable belief that he was meant for something bigger. He would sit in his tiny room for hours, imagining the life he wanted, a life where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. He envisioned a successful business, one that would not only lift him out of poverty, but also create jobs for people like him, trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. It wasn't long before he came up with an idea. While most people in his community were preoccupied with day-to-day survival, Marcus noticed something others ignored. Small businesses in the area, corner stores, barber shops, and food trucks, were struggling to stay afloat, not because of a lack of customers, but because they couldn't compete with bigger chains. They lacked modern tools and the marketing savvy to attract more customers. Marcus knew the future was digital, and his idea was simple but revolutionary: a platform to help these local businesses market themselves online, manage their operations efficiently, and attract more business. The moment he shared his idea with his friends and family, they laughed. His brother Tyrone, who had long stopped dreaming, shook his head. A business? In this place? You're kidding yourself, Marcus. Nobody here is going to buy into that tech nonsense. We're just trying to survive. But Marcus didn't let their doubt deter him. In fact, it fueled him. He knew that their negativity wasn't about him. It was about the environment they had grown up in. They couldn't see past the daily struggles because they had never been shown anything else. Marcus had to be the one to show them, even if they didn't believe in him yet. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus worked tirelessly. After school, he'd head to the local library, using their slow computers to teach himself everything he could about technology, marketing, and business development. He learned how to code by watching free online tutorials and took notes on business strategies used by successful entrepreneurs. Even though he had no formal education in business, Marcus had a drive that couldn't be taught. But the road to success was far from easy. His first attempt to pitch the idea to a small business owner, a local grocer, ended in disappointment. The man laughed him out of the store. "You think some app is going to save this place, kid? I've been doing this for 20 years. You better stick to your books and get yourself a real job." Defeated but not broken, Marcus continued. He realized that his biggest challenge wasn't just building the platform, it was convincing people to believe in something they'd never seen work before. He needed to prove that his idea could change lives. For months, he worked on his business during any free moment he had. He created mock-ups of the app and even developed a basic website. But when it came time to seek funding to grow his idea, he hit another wall. Banks wouldn't give him a loan. Investors didn't want to take a chance on a kid from a poor neighborhood with no experience. His heart sank with every rejection, but Marcus was determined not to give up. One night, after a particularly tough day of rejection, Marcus returned home and saw his younger sister sitting at the dining room table, trying to finish her homework by candlelight. Their electricity had been cut off again. That was the breaking point for Marcus. He knew he had to find a way, not just for himself, but for his family and everyone in his community who deserved more than the hand they were dealt. He decided to approach the project differently. Instead of seeking outside funding, he offered his services for free to a struggling local bakery. The owner, Mrs. Johnson, was skeptical but desperate for help. She'd been running her bakery for over a decade, but business had been slow, and she was on the verge of closing down. With Marcus's help, they created a simple website for the bakery, and he started running social media campaigns, highlighting Mrs. Johnson's homemade treats. Within weeks, the bakery started to gain more attention. Local customers began flooding in, and Mrs. Johnson even received a few catering orders from nearby businesses. The transformation was small but significant. Word spread quickly. Soon, other small business owners started approaching Marcus for help. He built websites, set up social media pages, and taught them how to manage their online presence, all free of charge at first. His reputation grew, and with it, so did his confidence. It wasn't long before he started charging for his services, and finally, businesses were willing to pay. The platform he'd once only dreamed of was becoming a reality. He hired a few friends who had laughed at him before to help with the workload. Now, they were believers, inspired by what Marcus had accomplished. As the business grew, Marcus didn't forget where he came from. He made it his mission to mentor other young dreamers in the neighborhood, teaching them that they, too, could rise above their circumstances. He created internship programs for kids at the local high school, giving them the tools and skills they needed to break free from the cycle of poverty. Years later, Marcus's company, now named EmpowerNet, was a thriving business, connecting hundreds of small businesses to the digital world. It had become a lifeline for struggling entrepreneurs across the city. At the grand opening of his new office, Marcus stood in front of a crowd of supporters, family, and friends. His brother Tyrone was in the front row, proudly clapping. As Marcus took the microphone, he looked out at the people who had once doubted him and smiled. "I was told I couldn't make it, that a kid from this neighborhood didn't stand a chance," he said. "But I'm here to tell you, no matter where you come from, if you have a vision and you believe in it, nothing can stop you." Despite the early successes Marcus had experienced, his journey was far from over. EmpowerNet was still a small operation, and Marcus knew that to truly grow and scale his business, he needed outside investment. His vision was grander than just helping a few local businesses. He wanted to create a platform that could uplift entire communities across the country. To do that, he needed partners, investors, and more resources. But turning that dream into reality was harder than he ever imagined. With confidence, Marcus began pitching his idea to investors. Armed with data from the successes of the local businesses he had helped, he felt sure that someone would see the potential in EmpowerNet. But time and time again, he was met with rejection. Investors, many of whom had never set foot in neighborhoods like Marcus's, couldn't understand the need for his platform. They looked at the small businesses Marcus was working with and saw only risk. "The businesses you're helping, Marcus, they don't have the margins to make this work long term," one investor said dismissively after a presentation. "They can barely keep their doors open. Why should we believe they'll invest in something like this?" Others couldn't get past Marcus's background. To them, he was just another young, inexperienced entrepreneur with a big idea and no pedigree. The meetings often ended the same way, with polite nods and empty promises to follow up, but no real commitments. Even when Marcus pitched to local organizations designed to help underserved communities, he faced skepticism. Many of the people sitting across the table from him had seen countless failed businesses come and go from their neighborhoods. "We've heard ideas like this before," one local nonprofit director told him. "They sound great on paper, but execution is another story. We can't afford to put resources into something unproven." Each rejection stung more than the last. Marcus had put everything into EmpowerNet, his time, energy, and heart. He started doubting himself, questioning whether his vision was really as strong as he thought it was. He wondered if the investors were right, if perhaps small businesses in his community were destined to struggle, and his efforts would only provide temporary relief rather than lasting change. Friends, too, started to drift away. Early on, they had been inspired by Marcus's passion and vision, but now that things weren't moving as quickly as expected, they began to lose interest. "Maybe it's time to cut your losses," one of his childhood friends said one evening. "You've done a lot already. You can still get a regular job and be fine." But Marcus wasn't looking for fine. He wasn't just building a business for personal gain. He was trying to create something that would change lives, including his own. Still, the constant setbacks were wearing on him. Each door that closed seemed to chip away at his resolve, and for the first time since starting his journey, Marcus seriously considered giving up. One night, after another fruitless pitch, Marcus returned home to his cramped apartment. He sat in the dark, feeling the weight of all his failures pressing down on him. The doubts, once whispers in the back of his mind, were now screaming. Maybe this was as far as he was meant to go. Just as he was about to close his laptop and walk away from the dream he had nurtured for so long, a message notification popped up. It was from Mrs. Johnson, the bakery owner he had helped early on. The message was simple but powerful. "You saved my business, Marcus. Don't stop now. We believe in you." Those words hit him like a jolt of electricity. He remembered why he started this journey in the first place. Not for investors, not for fame, but for people like Mrs. Johnson. She had trusted him when no one else did, and he had made a real difference in her life. That reminder was enough to reignite the fire inside him. Instead of focusing on the rejections, Marcus decided to take a different approach. He went back to his roots, the community that had believed in him when no one else had. He began organizing local events and workshops, teaching small business owners how to use digital tools to grow their businesses, even if they couldn't afford to hire him. He offered free advice and built a network of businesses that supported one another. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The local businesses Marcus had helped started speaking about him to others. Word of mouth spread, and eventually, some of the very investors who had turned him down began to take notice. They saw the tangible impact EmpowerNet was having in the community. Marcus's vision was no longer just an idea on paper. It was a movement gaining momentum. Although it took much longer than he had hoped, Marcus eventually found a small group of investors who believed in his mission. They weren't the big players he initially sought, but they were aligned with his vision. With their support, he expanded EmpowerNet beyond his neighborhood, reaching other underserved communities across the state. The rejections didn't stop coming, but Marcus had learned a crucial lesson. Success wasn't about how many times you got turned down. It was about how many times you got back up. Marcus had weathered storms before, but nothing could have prepared him for the crisis that was about to hit. EmpowerNet was gaining traction in his local community and beyond. Small businesses were slowly adopting his platform, and with the help of his new investors, Marcus was beginning to see his vision take shape. However, success came with its own set of challenges. As the company grew, so did the pressure. Managing a growing team, meeting the demands of the investors, and ensuring his platform scaled properly stretched Marcus thin. He worked long hours, often sacrificing sleep and personal time, believing that every minute mattered in keeping EmpowerNet afloat. But amidst all this, Marcus's personal life began to unravel. His mother, who had always been his rock, fell seriously ill. She had raised Marcus and his siblings with fierce determination, making sure they survived the harshness of the neighborhood they grew up in. Her health had been declining for months, but Marcus had been too focused on the business to notice. Now, as her condition worsened, Marcus found himself torn between his responsibilities to EmpowerNet and his need to be by her side. On top of that, the financials of EmpowerNet were starting to falter. The initial wave of excitement that had come with the platform's launch was waning, and the revenue wasn't keeping up with the costs. Investors, once excited about the potential of Marcus's idea, were now growing impatient. Some began to pull their funding, and others questioned his leadership. They demanded faster results, bigger returns, and more aggressive growth strategies. Marcus, already emotionally exhausted, felt crushed under the weight of their expectations. He couldn't lose the business he had fought so hard to build, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore his mother's worsening condition. Every decision felt like a lose-lose situation, and for the first time since starting EmpowerNet, Marcus felt like he was losing control. The final blow came when a key investor, who had initially pledged substantial funding, abruptly backed out. The investor cited concerns about Marcus's leadership and the scalability of the business model. Without that crucial funding, EmpowerNet was at risk of collapsing. Payroll became a problem, vendors were knocking on his door for payments, and the team, once filled with hope, began to doubt the company's future. The cracks in his dream were growing wider. Night, as Marcus sat in the hospital next to his mother's bed, watching her sleep, he was hit with an overwhelming wave of helplessness. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance would get him through anything, but now, even those traits seemed useless. His mother's health was slipping away, and EmpowerNet was on the brink of bankruptcy. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, felt like it was crumbling before his eyes. As he sat there, staring at his phone with dozens of unread emails and messages, Marcus considered the unthinkable, giving up. The thought of walking away from EmpowerNet was something he had never entertained before. But now, the idea lingered. Maybe his friends had been right all along. Maybe he was just a kid with a wild dream that was never meant to succeed. Maybe the investors were right, and he wasn't the leader EmpowerNet needed. Tears filled his eyes as he tried to imagine his life without the business. The idea of quitting felt like a betrayal, not just to himself, but to the community he had set out to help. But at that moment, with his mother fighting for her life and EmpowerNet hanging by a thread, Marcus couldn't see a way out. The weight of failure felt too heavy to bear. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus received a message from Tyrone, his older brother. Tyrone had been one of Marcus's biggest critics in the early days, but after seeing what EmpowerNet had accomplished, he had come around. Tyrone's message was brief but clear. "You've come too far to quit. Mom wouldn't want you to give up. You've got this, Marcus." Those words echoed in Marcus's mind. He knew his mother had always believed in him, even when no one else did. She had always told him he was destined for more. As he looked at her frail form lying in the hospital bed, he realized that quitting now would mean letting her down, and letting himself down too. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about everything he had fought for. His vision of helping small businesses, of lifting up his community, of proving that people like him could defy the odds. Marcus had faced rejection, doubt, and hardship before, but this was different. This was his darkest hour, the moment where everything could fall apart. But it was also the moment where he could choose to rise again. He wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood up. It was time to fight, not just for EmpowerNet, but for everything it represented. The next morning, Marcus made a series of tough decisions. He called an emergency meeting with his investors and team. He laid everything out on the table: the financial struggles, the personal toll, and the hard road ahead. But instead of focusing on the negatives, Marcus shared his renewed commitment to the business. He reminded them of why they had started in the first place and what they had already accomplished. "I know things look bleak right now," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "But this company was built on the idea that we can change lives. That doesn't change just because we've hit a rough patch. I'm not giving up, and I hope you won't either. We can turn this around, but we need to stick together." To his surprise, his team responded with enthusiasm. Some had doubted Marcus, but his raw honesty and determination inspired them. They rallied behind him, brainstorming ways to cut costs, increase revenue, and attract new clients. His investors, though still wary, appreciated his transparency and gave him a little more time to prove himself. Slowly but surely, EmpowerNet started to stabilize. It wasn't easy, and Marcus had to make some painful sacrifices, including cutting back on expansion plans and letting go of a few employees. But the core of the company remained intact, and Marcus emerged from his darkest hour stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever. After the meeting with his team and investors, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, but the weight of EmpowerNet's challenges still hung heavily over him. While he had managed to buy a little more time for his business, the future was still uncertain. Every day was a battle to keep the company afloat, and each decision felt like a tightrope walk over an abyss. Though Marcus had regained some confidence, the constant pressure left him feeling like he was still one wrong move away from losing everything. It was during this time that Marcus ran into someone who would forever change the trajectory of his journey: an old mentor named Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson had been a teacher at Marcus's high school, one of the few people who had ever taken the time to believe in him when he was younger. He had always been a man of few words, but his wisdom had left a lasting impression on Marcus during his teenage years. One afternoon, feeling particularly defeated after a long, grueling week, Marcus decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood to clear his mind. As he passed the high school, he noticed Mr. Davidson sitting on a bench outside, reading a book. It had been years since they had last spoken, but Marcus felt an urge to stop and say hello. "Mr. Davidson?" Marcus called out, approaching him. The older man looked up, smiled warmly, and closed his book. "Marcus Taylor, I knew you'd make something of yourself," he said, his eyes full of pride. "What brings you by?" After exchanging pleasantries, Marcus found himself opening up to Mr. Davidson about everything that had been weighing on him. The struggles with EmpowerNet, his mother's illness, the financial strain, and the doubts that had begun creeping back into his mind. Mr. Davidson listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. Once Marcus had finished, Mr. Davidson sat back and let out a long breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said, finally breaking the silence. "It sounds like you've been fighting every step of the way." Marcus nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Yeah, and some days I just don't know if I have it in me to keep going." Mr. Davidson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marcus, let me tell you something. Adversity is the only thing that separates those who succeed from those who give up. It's not about the talent, the resources, or even the idea itself. It's about resilience. The ones who succeed aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones who fail and keep going. I've seen a lot of young men from this neighborhood give up when things got hard, but I always knew you were different. You've got that fire, that drive, and it's what's brought you this far." Marcus looked down at the ground, reflecting on Mr. Davidson's words. "But what if I've hit my limit?" he asked quietly. "What if I've pushed as far as I can go, and it's still not enough?" Mr. Davidson shook his head. "Limits are in your mind, Marcus. You're in the middle of the storm, so it feels like you're at the edge. But you haven't seen what's on the other side of that storm. You think you're at your limit, but I can promise you, you've got more in you. The key is shifting your perspective." Marcus frowned, intrigued but confused. "What do you mean?" "You've been looking at adversity as something that's happening to you," Mr. Davidson explained. "But adversity isn't just an obstacle, it's an opportunity. Every challenge you've faced is a chance to grow, to learn, to find new solutions. The world doesn't owe you success just because you've worked hard, and it's not going to hand you victories on a silver platter. But every setback is a lesson in disguise. What you need to do now is shift your focus from survival to strategy." Marcus felt a spark ignite in his mind, but he still had doubts. "How do I do that when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Mr. Davidson smiled knowingly, "By stepping back and seeing the big picture. You've been in survival mode, fighting to keep your business alive day by day. But the best leaders, the most successful people, don't just react to problems. They anticipate them. They see the patterns, they adapt, and they plan ahead. Right now, you're so focused on keeping EmpowerNet from sinking that you haven't been thinking about how to navigate the long term. You need to reclaim your vision." Marcus sat in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. He realized Mr. Davidson was right. He had been so consumed by the daily grind of keeping the business afloat that he had lost sight of why he started EmpowerNet in the first place, to empower small businesses and change lives, not just to survive. "That makes sense," Marcus said finally. "But where do I start?" Mr. Davidson leaned back, a twinkle in his eye. "Start by going back to your roots. Remember why you started EmpowerNet. Remember the fire that got you here. Then take a hard look at everything you've learned along the way, every failure, every setback, and figure out what those experiences are trying to teach you. Once you do that, you'll start to see the solutions you've been missing." It was as if a light had switched on inside Marcus's head. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. He realized that adversity wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. It was a tool, a means of refining his strategy and becoming a better leader. That conversation with Mr. Davidson marked the beginning of a turning point for Marcus. He went home that night and started outlining a new plan for EmpowerNet, one that wasn't just about keeping the business alive, but about growing it in a way that aligned with his original vision. He reviewed his failures and saw them for what they were, lessons that had prepared him for this next phase. Marcus now understood that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the fire inside him, the one Mr. Davidson had always believed in, was still burning bright. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to thrive. And this time, he had a new perspective on how to do it. The conversation with Mr. Davidson had sparked something new inside Marcus. With a fresh perspective and a clearer sense of purpose, he set out to reclaim his vision for EmpowerNet. His first step was to reframe his approach, not just for himself, but for his team and investors. They weren't just in the business of helping small companies survive. They were creating a movement to empower communities, businesses, and people who had been overlooked and undervalued for too long. This wasn't just a business, it was a revolution. Marcus began by refining EmpowerNet's core mission and services. He knew that small businesses in underserved communities needed more than just a digital platform. They needed mentorship, financial literacy, and a strong support network. He reached out to local entrepreneurs who had succeeded against the odds and invited them to become mentors within EmpowerNet. He also developed partnerships with banks and credit unions that were willing to offer microloans and financial guidance to the small businesses EmpowerNet served. To address the concerns investors had raised about scalability, Marcus and his team restructured the platform to be more efficient and user-friendly, allowing for rapid onboarding of new businesses. They streamlined operations, cutting unnecessary costs while enhancing customer service. Marcus also doubled down on his commitment to education. EmpowerNet began offering free workshops and webinars, teaching business owners how to manage their finances, build an online presence, and leverage the tools available to them. Word of these changes quickly spread, and the local businesses EmpowerNet had helped started sharing their success stories. The platform's reputation grew, and Marcus soon found himself flooded with inquiries from businesses across the state, and eventually across the country. What had once been a small-scale operation struggling to survive was now gaining traction on a national level. Investors took notice. Some of the very people who had initially turned Marcus down came back, eager to get a piece of the action. But this time, Marcus wasn't desperate for their money. He was in a position to choose his partners carefully, ensuring they were aligned with his mission and vision. The pivotal moment came when EmpowerNet was featured in a national business magazine. The article, titled "The Platform That's Saving Main Street: How EmpowerNet is Redefining Small Business Success," detailed how Marcus and his team were revolutionizing the way small businesses in underserved communities were surviving and thriving. The story highlighted EmpowerNet's holistic approach, combining technology, mentorship, and financial support, and positioned the company as a trailblazer in the industry. Marcus could hardly believe it when the article went viral. Suddenly, EmpowerNet was on everyone's radar. National media outlets were reaching out for interviews, and larger corporations began expressing interest in partnerships. Marcus was invited to speak at conferences where he shared his story of resilience, failure, and eventual success. But the real breakthrough came when a major tech company approached Marcus with an offer to buy EmpowerNet. The company recognized the value in what Marcus had built and saw the potential to integrate EmpowerNet's model into their own operations. The offer was staggering, more money than Marcus had ever dreamed of. For a moment, he considered it. Selling the company would mean instant financial freedom, the ability to take care of his family, and the knowledge that he had built something worth millions. But as he sat with the offer, Marcus realized that money was never the reason he started EmpowerNet. The platform wasn't just a business. It was his way of giving back to the community that had raised him, of proving that people like him could succeed against the odds. After careful consideration, Marcus declined the offer. Instead, he negotiated a partnership that would allow EmpowerNet to scale globally while maintaining its independence. This way, EmpowerNet could continue to serve small businesses, particularly those in disadvantaged areas, while benefiting from the resources and infrastructure of a larger corporation. The partnership allowed EmpowerNet to expand into international markets, bringing its mission of empowerment to communities all over the world. As EmpowerNet grew, so did Marcus's influence. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story with entrepreneurs, business leaders, and students. His journey from the tough streets of his neighborhood to the CEO of a groundbreaking company inspired countless others to pursue their dreams, no matter the obstacles they faced. But Marcus never forgot his roots. He continued to invest in his local community, setting up scholarships for aspiring entrepreneurs, funding programs that supported small business development, and mentoring young people who reminded him of himself. EmpowerNet also launched a nonprofit arm dedicated to providing free business resources and mentorship to entrepreneurs in the most underserved communities across the globe. Years later, standing on a stage at a major entrepreneurship summit, Marcus looked out at the thousands of people gathered to hear him speak. The conference hall was packed with business leaders, innovators, and aspiring entrepreneurs. As he began his keynote speech, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From the boy with big dreams in a neighborhood that had told him success was impossible, to a man who had built something that was changing lives around the world. Success, Marcus said, his voice steady and confident, isn't about how many times you fail. It's about how many times you get back up and keep going. I've been rejected more times than I can count. I've faced obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome, but every setback taught me something, and every failure made me stronger. EmpowerNet was never just about making money. It was about proving that people from places like mine have value, that we can create, innovate, and succeed on our own terms. The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus's mind was already elsewhere. He thought of his mother, now fully recovered and watching proudly from the front row. He thought of Mr. Davidson, whose simple yet profound advice had changed everything. And he thought of the countless small business owners EmpowerNet had helped, people who had been told their dreams were too small, their ideas too risky, but who now stood as proof that success was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. EmpowerNet wasn't just a company anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of hope, of what could happen when someone dared to dream big and refused to give up. Marcus had redefined what it meant to succeed against all odds, and in doing so, he had changed not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of others. As he left the stage that day, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.